This is going to be a long one. Hey besties, this is the last installment of a little series that I like to call I Can't Believe It's Not Misogyny, Misogynoir, Classism, Colorism, and Discrimination Against Gender Nonconforming Individuals. Except it's all of those things and more, and this is the sequel to the sequel, Electric Boogaloo 3. But that's way too long of a title, so let's just stick to... In part 1 of this series, I gave a brief overview of the second wave of feminism, the impact it had on gender roles at the time, and how that could possibly find its way into society and impact how we view women and how women view ourselves. In part 2 of this series, I gave an insight into how class may exclude impoverished people from expressing themselves in an ultra-feminine way, race may exclude people of color from expressing themselves in an ultra-feminine way, and how the two may intersect to further defeminize impoverished women of color. I also gave a tentative definition of what I view as ultra-feminine, which is simply a dramatic sense of stereotypical feminine things like makeup, clothing, shoes, and etc. But it's important to understand that femininity, like gender, is a spectrum and can be expressed in many different ways. What may be ultra-feminine to me may not be the same for you, and so on and so forth. I also want to emphasize that I am a cisgendered woman who presents herself in a traditionally feminine way. So I reap the privilege of never being as violently discriminated against for my gender expression the way gender nonconforming individuals are. That also means that I'm merely a vessel of knowledge and not a direct source, so it's very possible that I don't get some information 100% correct. In that case, please correct me down below in the comments. With all of that being said, let's begin by discussing the gender binary. The gender binary in of itself is a colonial object. Lucas Bolestin, a PhD student in the philosophy at New School for Social Research, defines a colonial object as, quote, objects that are embedded, reproduced, and circulated within a concrete colonial practice, end quote. What Bolestin means by that is basically the cultural concepts that were almost exclusively tied to European culture were forced upon cultures that were colonized by Europe, such as African, Asian, and American countries. Gender is a colonial object because it was embedded, reproduced, and circulated via colonization in countries that did not previously consider gender as a binary before. Bolestin uses an argument originally presented by Argentina philosopher Lugones, which asserts that the gender binary that we've come to know today was in fact not inevitable, but forced upon us by colonization. Moving backward to trace the history of the gender system, and then forward to connect pre-colonial gender systems with contemporary notions of feminist, queer, and trans emancipation and resistance, Lugones emphasizes the historical specificity of the binary, cis-heterosexist gender system, thereby challenging its inevitability. For example, prior to colonization, the Yoruba, an ethnic group within Nigeria, didn't place emphasis on gender the way Europeans did. Quote, gender categories were diverse, not necessarily tied to anatomy, and generally much more porous than the binary European system. And importantly, the boundaries between positions were porous so that people could at times move beyond them or occupy intermediary spaces. Further, Persian culture was heavily influenced by European ideals, even though it was never formally colonized by the UK. Even though same-sex relations were common in Persian culture prior, it became less prevalent once the concept of heteronormativity was introduced by European culture. We can also see how colonization enforced the gender binary within indigenous cultures as well. Prior to colonization, there was, and still is, the third gender within various indigenous cultures. Similar to the reinforcement of the gender binary, the tomboy figure specifically stemmed from white supremacy. Around the time of abolition, tomboyism was encouraged among white, middle, and upper-class women as fears of the white race allegedly dying out spread. This fear stemmed from the abolitionist movement in the 1840s and 1850s, as well as a fear of immigration that would make white people the quote-unquote minority. By encouraging a more active outdoor lifestyle upon young women, white, middle, and upper-class sectors eased their fear, as they believed that this would prepare white girls for the, quote, physical and psychological demands of marriage and motherhood, end quote. Or to put it more simply, more white girls would marry more white boys, produce more white children, and save the white race from being intruded upon by people of color. How charming. As history became the present and the present fell away to the future, the tomboy figure has morphed. Starting in the 1500s as a way to refer to boys who acted outside the traditional politeness, it soon became a term for girls who acted outside the realm of traditional femininity. That doesn't mean tomboys hate being a girl or think they're better than girly girls. They simply have interests in fashion and hobbies and lifestyle that fall into what's considered male. Trying to capitalize off of second wave feminism during the 1970s, brands did what most brands do when they want to seem woke with a capital I want your money. They began using the tomboy figure in their ads to further the discussion of gender roles started by the women's movement at the time. In one ad from the 1970s, Stay Free depicted a woman and a man hiking. The woman, who was advertising Stay Free's pads, says that the new design of the product allows her to, quote, keep up with Jeff like a real trooper. As the Atlantic article explains, this ad, quote, promises women that they can be on their period, but still do guy stuff. The tomboy figure became extremely popular around this time and found its way into the media. Just to name a few tomboy characters as examples, there's Buttercup from the Powerpuff Girls, Becky from 1994's Little Giant, Ashley Spinelli from Recess, and Sam Puckett from iCarly. And just to make it clear, these characters are written to be tomboys, though some of them may not accurately reflect tomboyism to a T. What's interesting about tomboys in the media to me is their association with adolescence, where we see multiple ultra-feminine women being depicted as grown-ups. We usually only see tomboyism being presented by children in the media, despite there being tomboy adults. The tomboy's association with one's own childhood or the various depictions of tomboys as young girls can insinuate that tomboyism is shed once a person matures into an adult. Once they grow up, they somehow fall comfortably into femininity because that's what's expected by our society for people who are assigned female at birth. This is further strained by the fact that the tomboy figure has since been declared obsolete or outdated as a trope in the media and in real life, despite it being a valid gender expression. In fact, many tomboyish girls are expected to grow into or transform into traditional femininity rather than people, minding their own business and allowing tomboys to express themselves how they see fit. In a Tab article titled "The Struggles of Being an Adult Tomboy," Erin Penny discusses their experience as an adult tomboy after years of people telling them that they would simply grow out of it. Erin receives numerous questions about their gender expression, such as why they don't act womanly, why they think they're better than other traditionally feminine girls, and why they're offended by such questions in the first place. Erin goes on to say that being categorized as not like other girls simply because they have interests that don't fall into traditional femininity is isolating. This was especially interesting to me because the same conversation was brought up in the comment section of part 1 of this series, where everyone more or less agreed that it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, where tomboyish people are ridiculed for not being feminine, and feminine characters are sometimes ridiculed for being too feminine. Because of the way women are viewed in society, that is, their worth is oftentimes measured by their beauty, which is often associated with traditional femininity, they are expected to quote-unquote mature past their tomboy interests. The binary creates a wall between male and female, where women are expected to act and present themselves one way, while men are expected to act and present themselves in an entirely different way. That may make it impossible for women who have no interest in traditionally girly things, or women who don't express themselves as traditionally feminine to be themselves without society waiting for them to transform. An interesting connection that I've noticed through research and speaking to gender non-conforming individuals, specifically assigned female at birth individuals, is the interconnectedness of this sort of expectation to transform into a feminine presenting person because of that wall that separates male from female, which doesn't allow room for people to be fluid or non-binary. Something that I failed to mention in part 1 of this series is that pretty privilege and gender-conforming privilege is undeniable. Ultra-feminine women may be showcased as the evil or mean one in the media examples that I gave, but they are also shown as popular and rich. No matter how many mean girl stereotypes that exist in the media, feminine-presenting cisgendered women will always have privilege. Because for every 10 demonized, ultra-feminine women in the media, there are possibly hundreds more who are presented as respectable, desired, and perfect representation of a woman because of her feminine expression. That's what I loved about my comment section under that video, by the way. That being the discussion that started around beauty politics. Even when a character is written to be unattractive or plain, they're still played by conventionally attractive people because that's what's expected. And in real life, gender nonconforming individuals are essentially shunned and discriminated against simply for their gender expression because it doesn't fit into the box that was ascribed by society. Because I'm a cisgendered woman who presents herself in a traditionally feminine sense, therefore never having to experience the same discrimination a gender nonconforming individual would, I asked on my Instagram if gender nonconforming individuals would tell me a bit about their experiences with the gender binary and their gender expression as a whole. Keep in mind, I received about 10 replies while creating this script, so this is definitely not a comprehensive guide. One experience that I had the privilege of reading from a follower was that they feel incapable of separating their experience with gender from how other people experience their gender. Meaning their gender is assumed to be one thing by other people due to their physical body instead of people going off of gender expression or behavior. Numerous replies included that the gender binary was suppressive because it confuses and limits one's own expression to two alternating poles, which doesn't allow flexibility. Unfortunately, a great majority of people who did respond to me feel unsafe or uncomfortable telling their families or even strangers about their gender identity as a whole, let alone expressing their gender in a way that makes them comfortable. Unless, of course, it is their assigned gender at birth, which across the board was noted to be the more acceptable expression to show around their family and friends. This discomfort and fear of telling others stem from the belief that they will be treated differently or ostracized, as well as lived experience of being treated differently or being ostracized when they did tell others. Media depictions of non-binary people, according to the replies I got, is little to none. However, in recent years, there have been representations of non-binary people in the media, as well as books. Representation on apps like Instagram and TikTok have also helped gender nonconforming individuals see themselves represented in media, and it has also helped them come to terms with their gender expression. I think it would be irresponsible for me to talk about tomboys in the media and in real life without also bringing up gender nonconformity and how it's depicted in the media, as well as how gender nonconforming people are treated in real life. But I also want to make it very clear that while some gender nonconforming people grew up labeling themselves as a tomboy or being labeled as such by their family, not every gender nonconforming individual identifies themselves, past or present, as a tomboy. I have cat hair all over me. In part 1, I mentioned that the tomboys specifically, at least in the examples that I've chosen, are preferred to ultra-feminine women. But now that I've refined what it means to be a tomboy and how gender expression is allowed to be a spectrum unhindered by the rigid guidelines of the binary, I've come to understand that tomboys aren't always preferred over ultra-feminine people. And even when they are, tomboys are still expected to be beautiful, no matter their gender expression, for them to be coveted in the media at all. I think that the characters that I referenced in past videos weren't actually reflective of tomboys because they were still expected to perform some form of femininity, whether that be through clothes or general appearance. In reality, these characters aren't tomboys, they're just not ultra feminine girls. These characters fall into the balance of being not too much, but are still required to be enough in the eyes of the male gaze and the feminine gaze. Why do you look so shocked? The male gaze isn't the only oppressive one around here. In fact, there are several movies and television shows that feature what I call the feminine gaze, not to be confused with this. My idea of the feminine gaze is the gaze that expects and sometimes demands women who don't take time on wardrobe or appearance to do it anyways for the sake of being accepted. I want to look at a few examples of tomboys in the media, as well as unfashionable women in the media who aren't accepted until they transform by choice or they are made to transform by others. This transformation more than always leads to these women adopting a more girly girl expression in order to get the guy, get the friends, or get the job. Thus, our train has arrived at our next stop, a little town I like to call male fantasies. Is everything run by male fantasies? The words of Margaret Atwood, written 28 years ago, still rings in my head to this day. Whether you're up on a pedestal or down on your knees, it's all a male fantasy. It's hard to believe that the heteropatriarchy has had this much of a lasting impact on women, but it's true. The alleged tomboy character in the media doesn't solely exist for women to navigate and express their gender the way they feel comfortable. Because nay, a woman can't exist only for herself. What do you think this is? A utopia that affords women the right to their own bodies? Hell no. Apparently. The idea of the male gaze, first coined by this dude, has since found ground in feminist theory. It refers to the, quote, act of depicting women and the world in the visual arts and in literature from a masculine, heterosexual perspective that presents and represents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the heterosexual male viewer, end quote. Writer and director Kim Leonard, author of What is the Male Gaze, states that, quote, female characters must perform their story function while also adhering to the heterosexual male sexual fantasy, though not always in a literal way. Simply being beautiful or sexy is all that's needed, end quote. And being beautiful or sexy is definitely a requirement somewhere in the fine print, as we have seen with numerous depictions of women in male-dominated movies, with male writers, male directors, and etc. So of course, women who don't fit into the traditional femininity, who don't ascribe to society's notion of what is considered beautiful and sexy, are a lot less useful to the male gaze or the story in general compared to her more feminine counterpart. When we view media depictions of women with this feminist lens, we see that certain versions of tomboy characters, that is, tomboys who express themselves with little to no femininity, aren't included. More often than not, they're not considered woman enough for men to objectify them. And it's not a new notion that just so happens to arise with film and television. The idea of a woman who doesn't adhere to typical gender roles being unattractive or less than a woman has been around for centuries. An interesting thing that I learned from my romanticism class in college was the legacy of the blue stocking woman. Blue stockings were women in the 18th century who were proponents of rationalism and intellectualism, and were in many ways the foremothers of what we've come to know as feminism. Many of the original founders were writers and immersed themselves heavily in political discussions. Girl, when I say they were hated, they were depicted like that Jackie Burkhart yearbook photo, voted most likely to ruin a talented man's potential type beat. John Keats even referred to them as the blue stocking devils, and the term blue stocking became a sort of insult at the end of the 18th century and was treated as a synonym for words like frumpy and fishwife. If you're like me and not an old English white person from the 1700s, you may not know what a fishwife is. Basically, it was a woman who sold fish, and they were known to be notoriously loud and foul-mouthed. Of course, that sort of behavior goes against everything white women were expected to be at the time. Unrelated to this specific time period, but definitely related to the way women were expected to behave, is the angel in the house ideology that was popular during the Victorian era. Women were expected to be submissive, pious, and quotably all around pure. So you can imagine pushing back against those expectations of your gender would be faced with hatred from traditionalists. The same can be said for suffragettes during the first wave of feminism during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There are numerous posters from that time period that declared suffragettes as ugly, vicious, unlovable, just because they wanted to obtain equity. Like, men were really like, if my wife isn't here to watch my kids, I'll have to do it. And that's not fair. What's so important that you can't watch your kids for an hour, Brad? Poker with the buddies? What did people do before technology? I really don't know. I got a bit off track. Let's get back into the male gaze and talk about Miss Congeniality. Released in 2000, Miss Congeniality follows Gracie, a tomboy FBI agent who is utterly separated from traditional femininity. Despite this, she undergoes a major transformation in order to fit into the Miss United States beauty pageant after it receives a threat. Her partner Eric refers to this as a punishment of sorts. He quotably doesn't view her as a woman and is rather antagonistic to her up until the point where she looks traditionally feminine. Post-transformation, there is a scene where Eric watches Gracie emerge as her new persona, and for once, he actually views her as a woman rather than one of the guys. Anyways, they try to make it make sense that they actually fall in love with one another. I don't really get it, but you know, whatever, male fantasies. The point is, Gracie becomes significant to Eric only once she becomes feminine enough in his eyes. By the end of the movie, Gracie isn't wholly uninterested in feminine things anymore, and Eric is simply enthralled by her all of a sudden. This trope of the male gaze affecting tomboys can be found in other movies and television series as well, like Allison Reynolds from The Breakfast Club, Sam from iCarly, and Becky from Little Giants, though the two latter definitely end in a twist. But in terms of tomboys or unfashionable women having to transform due to the feminine gaze, we see a tale as old as time unfolding. A tale as stubborn as dust, and as annoying as Ross Geller across the entire span of the Friends series. We have women pit against women. Clueless is a 1995 coming-of-age movie that follows the quirky and stepbrother-loving adventures of Cher Horowitz and her best friend Dion Davenport. In one of those quirky adventures, Cher tries to set up two teachers from her school in order to debate her way into raising one of her grades. After its success, Cher realizes that she has a talent for matchmaking. This spurs her into a charitable mood, at which she decides to help Ty Frazier, a tragically unhip new girl, with fitting in. The friendship between Cher, Dion, and Ty is innocent enough. In fact, I love them all individually and as a group. And the movie is just chef's kiss, except for, you know, that. But whatever. Cher subverts the diva trope that is often afforded to feminine, popular girls by being sincere and a friendly person. Dion is rendered to the background character who might as well have as much importance as a chunk of concrete, but hey, at least her outfits are popping. Who needs character development? Apparently not Black women. And Ty is a funny, sweet girl who simply wants to fit in at her new school with her new popular friends. But Ty is interested in Travis, who likes to light it up like dynamite, if you know what I mean, which prompts Cher and Dion to steer her away from a life of disappointment and into a life of beauty and popularity. Though Cher means well, she clearly finds a flaw in Ty's unfashionable, tomboyish ways and proceeds to treat her like a charity case under the guise of helping her fit in. Not only is Ty expected to change in order to be loved by what's-his-face, Elton John, but she's also expected to change for her traditionally feminine peers who feel that they need to be on the same level or else there's something wrong with her. Seeing as makeovers are a big trend from the 90s and 2000s films, it all seems innocent enough. But with those makeovers comes the reiteration of unfashionable women or tomboys being considered not enough by both their feminine peers and men. And once they are finally made over and they settle into a life of popularity and ultra-femininity, they become evil or are placed in direct competition with their other ultra-feminine peers. Don't know what this was. No matter how much ultra-feminine women are depicted as evil or dense in the media, it will never come close to how gender non-conforming individuals and tomboys are treated both in the media and in real life. As we have seen in countless movies, people who don't fit into society's beauty standards are often the butt of the joke. They are often left out, they are often killed off, or they are often forced to change. Is it too much to ask for women to simply exist without this growing expectation of cattiness? Is it too much to ask for tomboys to be allowed their interests without being vilified by ultra-feminine women and discarded by men? Is it too much to see plus-size women on screen without them being the butt of the joke? Is it too much to see dark-skinned Black girls who aren't painted as caricatures? Is it too much to ask for quality? For groundbreaking, stereotype-shaking content? I don't think so. But someone clearly does. I hate it here.